All right. Last thing we want to talk about in this chapter is biodiversity. Biodiversity is going to include the number of species living in a given area and the relative abundance of each species. Now, biodiversity is decreasing globally, especially in key critical areas. This is due primarily to habitat destruction. Human disturbances may lead to changes in biodiversity or lead to changes in that species richness. And this is due to a lot of things. Causes for a loss of biodiversity would be things like habitat destruction, alien species invading in areas where they weren't meant to be. Honeysuckle is a huge weed that has taken over the Midwest. It's not native to the Americas, and it's just gone crazy with being, as once it was introduced as a foreign species, it's kind of taken over um, a lot of native prairie grasses, plants, and habitats. Overexploitation is another huge problem. Fishing rivers dry or chopping down too many trees in a given forest so that way it can't recover in time. There are a lot of things that might cause the loss of biodiversity, but why do we care about that? Why do we care? I mean, and the thing is, there's a lot of reasons to care. Not just oh, it's good and we should be altruistic and care about the environment and stuff. No, there are some very practical, selfish reasons for caring. And I'm not saying that it's not good to care for the sake of caring, because that's, wonderful and nice and all sorts of really, really lovely things. But that's for a different class. I'm talking about there's very practical, selfish reasons to care about biodiversity. For example, genetic diversity is incredibly useful in crossbreeding and genetic engineering. We can create higher yield crops. We can find drought resistant crops. We can find better tasting crops. We can do a lot with crossbreeding and genetic engineering if we have that biodiversity to begin with. We can't create new genes. All we can do is take what there is, splice them together, and come up with something different. But we can't create new genetic material. And so, yeah, we need that biodiversity for crossbreeding and genetic engineering. We also find the vast majority of our pharmaceuticals come from the natural environment, come from plants, come from bacteria, come from funguses. We heavily rely on biodiversity. We heavily rely on organisms out there to come up or to provide us with new drugs that are useful in developing new medications. Organisms are also critical to properly functioning biogeochemical cycles. If you don't care about biodiversity, but you should care about our water cycle. You should care about our carbon cycle. You should care about the amount of carbon dioxide in the air and the amount of oxygen in the air. We need oxygen, and we can't produce that ourselves. And there's no more oxygen coming into our planet from outer space. We only have as much oxygen as our producers can produce. Therefore, it's very important to keep our producers around. We need them for oxygen. We need them to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We need them to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in a form of glucose so that way we can eat it. We can't make our own food. As human beings, we can't make our own food. We can't make our own oxygen. We are heavily reliant on the natural world around us to supply us with the things that we need. So we need to care about biodiversity. We need to care about maintaining the Earth's resources. We need to care for a lot of reasons. So those are just 3 very selfish reasons for caring about biodiversity. But please join a discussion group, comment on our discussion board, send me an email, tell me some of the ways that you can care, some of the reasons why you should care about biodiversity, and what can you do in your home, in your world, in your environment, in this time to help promote biodiversity. I'm going to throw one out there. This isn't a huge step. This is just what I do in my own little way. I let my grass grow as long as reasonably possible, until it upsets my neighbors. But I've found that when I let my grass grow and when I let whatever, and I don't in any way change whatever's in my yard. I've got like probably 40 different varieties of grass growing back there. And I leave my yard as undisturbed for as long as possible to promote. And it is obvious. I do have an abundance of insects in my backyard. The crickets can get pretty loud. But I also have one thing I have in my yard that I don't see in my neighbor's yard who cut their grass very often. They keep it very short. I have a lot of bees. And not just bees, I have flies, I have fruit flies, I've got mosquitoes, unfortunately, but I have an abundance of pollinators. I recently found that I am terrible at growing vegetables, so I pulled all of the vegetables out of my garden, and I found native Illinois species that are going to attract pollinators. So my garden is still very short, but it is growing a random assortment of native Illinois flowers that are there to attract bees, attract pollinators, attract butterflies, which will, on the one hand, very good for the plants to have those pollinators, very good for the bees, also very good for the birds that live in the tree in my backyard, that they've got an abundance of insects to prey on. It's not a lot, but it's one way that I can help contribute to the biodiversity in my neighborhood. One way that I can help contribute to the pollinators of my neighborhood is by, one, giving them a space full of plants specifically dedicated to serving them, and then two, I try not to annoy my neighbors. My yard isn't overrun with wild pests, but I do my best to not disturb the organisms that call my backyard home. Do my best to not mow my yard or scare off the rabbits that live there. So yes, that's just one way that I'm trying to help contribute to the biodiversity here in Springfield, Illinois, in the middle of the city, in my own backyard. So that's biodiversity. At the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe the Earth as a closed system with energy as the only input. You should be able to define and use the terms biosphere, ecosystem, community, population, niche, and habitat. You should be able to differentiate between producers, consumers, food chains, food webs, herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, and decomposers. Now, we did not talk about biogeochemical cycling. There just isn't enough time this semester, but I would like you to at least review those sections of the textbook because those biogeochemical cycles of water, nitrogen, phosphorus are all hugely important, and that's a very big role that biodiversity plays for us, is in help maintaining those energy cycles. So at least skim through that chapter. I'm not going to quiz you over it. I'm not going to ask you about it, but I do think it's going to contribute to a greater understanding and appreciation for biodiversity. So at least glance through it, please. All right. And then you should also be able to defend the ecological importance of biodiversity. All right, and that's it for this chapter.